only the foundations or if only government could pay on a systematic basis for the outcomes that our organization could create, and if only we could make that case and scale up to be able to do that, well, hey, that's the beginning of what social finance will become.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce McDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our knowledge partner, Carter's Professional Corporation, and our supporting partner, Sage Canada. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. In this episode, we're going to dig into a growing part of the mixed ecology that makes up social good in this country, social innovation. For our purposes today, we're going to describe social innovation as new ideas, methods, or practices for solving social or environmental problems which, once adopted, have a transformative impact across organizations, communities, regions, and systems. Over the last decade or so, we have witnessed the rise of new ways for engaging in the betterment of communities. While sometimes connected to the charitable and/or not-for-profit model, social entrepreneurship is testing new ways of providing access to investment capital, creating public and private partnerships, and expanding the range of possibilities for identifying solutions to complex social problems. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Graham Singh, Chief Executive Officer of the Montreal-based Trinity Centres Foundation. The organization that Graham leads has been a major innovator in transforming space for community benefit. Graham, welcome. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Great to be with you. And I know we have many common friends joining us today. So welcome and hello to all of our listeners.
We're going to have the opportunity to talk more specifically about aspects of social innovation. But to get warmed up, maybe you could take a few minutes and tell us about the Trinity Centres Foundation and the work it does.
Thanks again, Bruce. Well, the Trinity Centres Foundation is a registered charity based in Montreal. And the question that we look to solve is really around what are we going to do with all of the faith-based properties around Canada. These are places of worship, monastic properties, maybe there was a residence involved, properties that have been owned by a religious organization. Most of those are Christian organizations. We do have a growing challenge with synagogues. We don't have an oversupply of closed mosques or gurudwaras around Canada. Most of those are pretty active. But we're trying to figure out what do we do with those properties, working together with their existing owners, many of which continue to be faith-based organizations. And we're working to connect that with foundations, with municipalities, with other civic actors who are trying to look at the broader question of social purpose real estate. So we run a consultancy within the foundation that helps property owners and systems. We have increasingly service provision to cities as a whole. Happy to tell you more about that. But our hope and our direction is towards exactly the direction we're going today, which is what kind of new financing instruments and structures can we put in place to help see these properties truly serve the local communities who need that space.
Amazing. And I've had the chance to visit one of the properties in Montreal, and it's amazing to see the transformation of that space and how it's being used really by the whole community.
Yeah, so that site you're referring to, Bruce, we call it St. Jacques, Montreal. It's a 150-year-old church in the middle of downtown Montreal on St. Catherine Street. And it's become famous for one of Montreal's circus companies, which is now also based out of that place. So we have a refugee charity. We have 2 Indigenous night nonprofits. We have a pay-as-you-go food market, 3 religious organizations, and a circus company. And all of them share that space. So yeah, it's an iconic part of our network, and we're excited to see more and more properties like that springing up around Canada. I guess our other favorite one, if I can, please forgive me for saying favorites, but in Edmonton, we helped put 3 Muslim communities into the oldest church in Edmonton, and that is shared together with the United Church there. And we pulled that together on Ramadan and Good Friday, which happened to overlap as dates on the calendar. So Muslims made food to thank the Christians for sharing their space. So that's kind of the way we roll. We love to see that kind of vibrant activity come out of these places.
Great examples. So we're going to broaden the conversation a little bit here. You've provided some examples of the specific work that the Trinity Centers Foundation does, but let's talk about the broader concept. From your perspective, what does social finance mean? And how does it differ from traditional sources of income such as donation and grants? And why do you think that's important for groups like nonprofit organizations?
Social finance is a subcategory of impact finance. And the best definition I know of for impact finance comes from the Global Impact Investing Network, or the GIN. And the GIN describes impact investing as investments which are made with the intention to generate positive, measurable social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. So social impact finance would be the social part of that. And of course, we know that when we create social impact, very often positive environmental impact comes alongside. So impact finance is the wider category that I would point to. And social finance is generally the kind of tool that a social purpose organization could use, where money or funds are coming in such a way that they're used and they're then returned to the original source. So the difference between grants and finance: a grant goes in, is spent on the program, and does not return to the grantor. Whereas in the case of social finance, at least some of that capital would return. And the art form and the creativity and the innovation around by what means does it return? What impact has it also created at the time? This is this beautiful world we're in of exploring social finance.
And I think those are helpful clarifications, particularly for individuals for whom the conversation around social finance and social innovation may be somewhat new. Since the current federal government was elected in 2015, it's expressed a keen interest in social innovation as a way to address major societal issues. Most recently, the government's approach to social innovation and social finance has contained three foundational elements: the Investment Readiness Program, the Social Finance Fund, and the recently announced Social Innovation Advisory Council. Over $800 million has been committed through the Investment Readiness Program and the Social Finance Fund. This represents a major investment and a departure from historical practices of viewing charities and nonprofits as the main instruments of community benefit. From your perspective, how are things going? Are you seeing more players enter this space?
We are very excited about the entire journey of social finance from the federal government of Canada. We are seeing more players and more diverse players, more organizations who would not normally see themselves as innovators in the area of finance, but they're saying, we know how to do something great in local communities. And if only we could finance what we're doing in a different way, look at what we could do next. And so the Investment Readiness Program is helping to give to those organizations the tools to be able to talk about those kind of financing opportunities. The program I just mentioned with putting the 3 Muslim communities into the oldest church in Edmonton, that was in fact funded by the IRP, the Investment Readiness Program. And in fact, one of the people who made that funding possible is now sitting as a member of the Social Innovation Council. And certainly for our work in putting our work forward to become an intermediary for the Social Finance Fund, we are very much using that example as one of the many examples that we want to point to. So we're in the middle of that system that you just described. We see a lot of colleagues there. And I would say in my own journey of preparedness for this, and in some ways, many of our listeners may say, look, I know how to get things done on the ground. I know how to apply for grants. That's what I do all day. Hopefully not all day, every day, but certainly many of our listeners will spend significant amounts of their personal time as leaders in the nonprofit sector and of their organization's time. Many people would say, I think I get where you're going here, but what does that practically mean? And in my case, I'm also very thankful to other opportunities that I've had alongside this to learn and figure out what this means for myself. So as we're speaking here today, I'm thinking of others like myself who, they're on the ground, they know this stuff, but they're now at this point, as social finance becomes more real, and we'll talk about why that should become real with the launch of the Social Finance Fund, which we hope really is going to be the big story of 2023. The question of how do we learn how to do this is something that I've journeyed through personally and continue to journey through right now.
And it's certainly interesting, having worked in the charitable and nonprofit sector for a long time, that question of where can organizations, their leaders, their boards, their staff find investment capital for new ideas is one that has been around forever. And so now having additional instruments or opportunities with which to invest in new ideas. It's kind of an interesting future that we see. So your organization, the Trinity Centers Foundation, has been a trailblazer in providing support services to convert former places of worship into community hubs. And while you have nicely outlined what the organization does and some great examples and the impact it's had, what have been the hurdles that you've had to overcome to create the model that's now in operation?
Well, as you know, Bruce, along with some of your Imagine Canada colleagues, we were all together a few months ago in Ottawa celebrating the Sustainable Finance Forum, which very much is paving the way for the federal government engaging further and including in their financing of social finance in Canada. And at that time, I had the opportunity to answer this question fairly succinctly. And the way I said it then, I'll say again now, which is my mother always taught us not to talk about politics or religion at the dinner table. I always found that very difficult. But, here we are in Ottawa. Here we are talking across Canada with our colleagues in social finance. We can talk politics a little bit more openly, but talking about religion is still very difficult anytime we go near the social sector or near government. And that's okay and understandable until we realize the religious sector is the largest single landowning sector of the social sector, or largest single category. So if we're unwilling to engage religious land, we're missing our largest single landowning group. So I would say our number one barrier is the religious question itself. And that's our first task, is de-risking the religious environment itself. And often that means Black-led, LGBTQ2 spirit-led, women-led organizations who want to express their great concern with working with religious organizations. We take care to make a space to make sure that concern is heard at the beginning, the middle, and the end of any of these discussions. Social finance is also described as creating a market for outcomes. And part of the outcomes is getting those justice questions right. So I would say some of the hurdles that we face with people saying, we don't want to talk to those religious people. We say, well, what if there was a way that you could? And what if there was a way that they were hoping to commit their land to something in the future? So again, the religious question. The second one for us, it's a big one, is heritage buildings. A lot of our work does surround heritage buildings, and some people on the call today will not have any connection to that. Others, if you do steward a heritage building, you'll know how much of a problem it presents for granting, because nobody wants to grant to fixing a heritage building. They want to grant to programs. Yet some of the most iconic and central places for social purpose real estate that we have in Canada, they are heritage buildings. So religious problems, heritage problems, those are some of the big ones. And the final one I would say is, which has both been our greatest hurdle, but also our greatest opportunity, is realizing we didn't mean to, but we kind of found ourselves on the front edge of what social purpose real estate and social finance would do together. So we've got a bit of a leading edge challenge, which is a fun place to be. I've been there before in my own journey here, which is through the church. No surprise there for anybody who may read my bio coming into this call. So the front edge is a funny place to be here, but in some ways I'd say everybody who even utters the phrase social finance will find themselves on the front edge of what the heck is that supposed to mean.
And I suspect for many, the idea or the term of social purpose real estate is even something they might be hearing for the first time today.
Yeah, so we would define that as shelters, community hubs, theaters, places of worship. We can get into schools and hospitals, but schools and hospitals tend to sit on their own as categories of institutional real estate. But social purpose real estate are properties that often are on land which was given for that purpose. That's certainly the case of places of worship. Go all the way back to Hudson's Bay Company times, and we have an immediate Indigenous problem, challenge, question around certain types of social purpose real estate. By what means was it given? Well, it was taken and then it was given. So we have a justice issue there. Second, social purpose real estate often is tax exempt. So there's a narrative that the community together has paid for that property and its access to municipal services. And the third, we have a narrative that this is our place, right? There's a story around that's ours. So yeah, social purpose real estate, there's a bit of a definition going into further into this conversation.
That's great. Thank you. It's for us at Imagine Canada, one of our interests in this whole area has been around the participation of charities and nonprofits. And in 2020, Imagine Canada produced a report called Are Charities Ready for Social Finance? Investment Readiness in Canada's Charitable Sector, With over 1,000 charities participating, it was a comprehensive view on how registered charities were looking at this emerging area. And let's talk about a few of the findings. 66% of respondents said either that they had never heard of the term social finance prior to their participation in the survey, or that they had heard of the term but are not clear on the details. In looking at barriers to participating in a social finance loan, a number of barriers emerged. Generating earned income, 25% of respondents said their organization is not currently involved in earned income activities. The ability to pay back the loan, 23% of respondents said they are uncertain about their ability to repay. And board buy-in for social finance, 21% of respondents said their board would not consider or approve a social finance loan. These numbers suggest that charities have, for the most part, a long way to go before diving into this area. Did these findings surprise you? And do you think they may have changed in the last couple of years?
The findings do not surprise me, and they don't surprise me because there's an earlier question we could ask is, does social finance actually exist in Canada? Or is it something everybody's talking about and hopes that it will exist one day soon? There are wonderful examples of where social finance exists. Probably my favorite, and it's an easy example for us to give to our listeners today, is from Windmill Microfinance. And for those of you who know the story for Windmill, it started with a doctor in the prairies who was delivering a baby in a hospital, and she could not find any nurses in the hospital to help her out. So she called the janitor and said, could the janitor help her deliver this baby? And the janitor did a wonderful job. And afterwards, the obstetrician said to the janitor, "You're the best janitor who's ever helped me deliver a baby, ever." And the janitor said, "Actually, I'm actually not only a janitor, I'm actually an obstetrician myself. I'm just from Nigeria and my qualifications are not recognized here." So that original obstetrician got together with a few other doctors and they lent to that Nigerian doctor $30,000 for her to become qualified as a Canadian obstetrician. In that case, that person comes off of any kind of social housing need. They are working in the hospital, they're paying taxes, they're providing another doctor in that place. Everything good happens from that. So Windmill Microfinance has scaled that. They now have an $18 million loan fund that lends qualified people like that person, that janitor obstetrician, $30,000, $40,000 a pop. It's an amazing example. That loan, it is repayable because you can see how the person once trained is able to repay the loan. The loan is at 2% from the foundations who've provided those funds. And there's now a donated fund as well, which is also there to pay back some of the foundations. So there's a borrowed fund and a donated fund. So imagine you said, I had an extra $10,000. I wanted to do good with that. You could donate that to that fund and Windmill would then go and turn that into capital within the loan fund. So does social finance in Canada exist? Yes. However, imagine I said something to you like, hey, why don't we create a real estate fund of all the homeless shelters in Canada? They all kind of close all the time. They're very difficult to run. Nobody wants them in their backyard. Why don't we create a real estate fund to just own homeless shelters? And then they'll rent them to the nonprofit program organizers, the actual service delivery groups, but they won't have to pay rent. That would be an exciting way of looking at this. And that's actually a lot closer to the kind of work that we're doing. Well, that kind of a fund does not yet exist. We do find from time to time a charitable foundation will buy a property and will individually own it and individually lease it to that nonprofit. But it's a kind of example of what is yet to come. So when somebody says on their board, I don't quite understand social finance, I think we have to take stock of what actually exists right now. When you go back to some of the survey responses, 25% said they don't really know how earned income could make this work. They don't know how they could repay. Partly, I would point there to the opportunity for what I described earlier as a market for outcomes. So if that nonprofit knows, I'll give you an example. In the UK, where I lived for 14 years, there was a program from a number of the London borough councils, so the municipalities within the Greater London Assembly, to pay for young people who were not in education, employment, or training. So they were known as NEETs. If you could get a NEET to be a NEET, going from being a NEET, not in education, employment, or training, to being in education, employment, or training, that was costing the municipalities around £7,500. Okay, £7,500. So around 12,000, 13,000 Canadian dollars. We could understand that, right? What another nonprofit did is they began delivering on this and charging for those outcomes. And the municipalities went in on that and said, if you can do this, and they then began to do it for a lower cost. And they looked at issues of how long do they stay in education, employment, or training. So you see, the outcome now can become something that that nonprofit can count on. So imagine that they had, and that particular nonprofit does have a very good system. Imagine they said, we've got the model. If only we had £1 million, we could scale up and staff up to make sure that we could do 3 times more output. You municipalities, you just need to promise to give us those grants when we continue to deliver those outcomes. And that's something that we have seen some of that in Canada, and it's part of the social finance ecosystem that I believe we're even here today to get people dreaming of. Maybe they're thinking to themselves, if only the foundations or if only government could pay on a systematic basis for the outcomes that our organization could create, and if only we could make that case and scale up to be able to do that, well, hey, that's the beginning of what social finance will become.
It certainly does, in that example, speak to the need for organizations to be able to articulate and measure their impacts and outcomes. And I think that's a discipline that the sector would really need to be thinking about.
Absolutely.
The participation of charities in social finance instruments is way behind that of social entrepreneurs. The same investment readiness study found that charities tend to be more doubtful about possessing the abilities critical for social finance readiness. The following abilities were more commonly reported by respondents to be weaknesses for their organization: raising unrestricted funds when needed at 41%, drawing on diverse range of revenue sources 35%, collecting evaluation data 35%, assessing full social environmental impact of work 32%, constantly and predictably generating an operating surplus at 28%, and drawing on existing assets when needed at 27%. Graham, your vantage point allows you a line of sight on both charities and entrepreneurs. What do you think charitable leaders need to consider to move past some of the barriers that the study identified?
So again, in comparing and contrasting traditional finance or traditional granting with social finance, it's important, I think, to think of going to the bank and asking about this, right? Let's say that a nonprofit went to the bank and said, I'd like to borrow $1 million, but I promise you, if I do that, these governments and these foundations will give me money on a regular basis so that I can pay your loan back. That's how good our idea is. Well, there's no mainstream bank in Canada that would be able or could support a loan of that kind. If those were the only factors on which the loan was being made, they might say, perhaps if all 10 of your staff members and 10 of your board members would like to put up security on their own primary residences, then perhaps we could do that. But in general, a traditional finance organization like a bank is not going to be able to respond to that. A charitable foundation, by contrast, may well say, listen, here's a nonprofit that we've known and loved and supported for years. We see their trajectory. We, though, are the granting committee of our foundation. The investment committee of our foundation is led by a retired banker from some well-known organization. And as one charity leader recently said to me the other day, Bruce, he said, Graham, my investment committee doesn't know how to spell impact investing. You know, my investment committee are very traditional finance people. That's why we appointed them. They put our money in the stock market and they hope that it will grow. They don't really like all kinds of environmental and divestment and, you know, social filters on their investments because they think their job is just to make as much money as they can so the granting committee can disperse it. So the problem that social entrepreneur needs to face is realizing that there are two sides of a granting foundation, and those two sides need to talk to each other. And I don't mean to put all the load on that on our foundations. However, many of our leading foundations, and I will name one of them, the McConnell Foundation, they have now declared that 100% of their $800 million portfolio will be impact investing. So that person who's on their own, if you're not careful as a social entrepreneur, leader of a social purpose organization, and you're thinking about social finance, if you're not careful, you will sound out all of your ideas with traditional finance people who have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. And it can become very discouraging. Better to talk to some of the leading foundations, figure out what they're trying to do. They are leading the way. I find as a good source of information the Oxford Said Business School Impact Finance Unit. I've taken one of their courses. I'm actually going to be co-teaching on one of their courses on social finance later this year. They're an amazing source of free information on LinkedIn, their newsletters, and surround yourself with good examples of what that is. But look, this is new, and there are many people that you might go to for help who have really never understood what social finance would be.
One of the points that you raised, though, which is interesting to me, is it sort of alludes to this idea of risk. And I think we know that many charitable organizations, they struggle with risk because if they don't have reserves or deep financial pockets, trying something new is challenging because there's little or no room for failure. And I think that part of what you're speaking to is if charitable leaders, their boards and their staff, were considering entering this space, finding trusted sources, education, information, so that that level of risk can be managed through knowledge and through expertise, might be a way to help organizations, their boards and their staff, be a bit more comfortable with this emergent area.
I'd like to address an issue within that risk. And I think this, again, it takes a little bit of a stretch for people who aren't used to thinking about this, but perhaps they can go with us on this, to think of the difference between a private endowment and a charitable endowment. You may even want to think of a public endowment like a pension fund. Okay, a public endowment like a pension fund needs to grow its money at a certain rate because there's a leak in the system. And that leak is people who draw down their pensions, right? It needs to be ready to pay out those pensions. In the case of a private endowment, the private organization or company or family, they may be depending on that money to go into their own operations. In the case of a charitable endowment, there's a deal between society and that charity. And that deal says, you, charitable foundation, are going to tell us your focus on the things in the world that need doing. They all need to be charitably recognized purposes, which the easy way is that you're giving to registered charities, right? Qualified donees. We've now extended that understanding of qualified donees to be even wider. But we as society trust charitable foundations to leak their money to the needs of society. That's the deal. It's gone, as we're all familiar, from 3.5% each year to 5% each year for larger endowments. Here's the issue of risk. If a charitable endowment or a charitable foundation with an endowment, if you want to call it that way, is investing in one of the programs that it would otherwise have granted to, then the risk is a lot lower because the whole point of that money is it's supposed to leak out into that nonprofit organization. And when those two things come together, one of the things I think we just need to be so careful about is that we don't talk about risk in investments as if that was a private or public endowment. It is in fact a charitable endowment. And its first obligation, I would argue, the first obligation of a registered charity in Canada is to all society, right? It's to the Charities Directorate of the Canada Revenue Agency who put their stamp on and said, yes, this is charitable. And every year that T3010 goes in and they say, yes, you were still charitable, right? It's not to, and I'm saying this as a member of a religious organization and leader of a number of related charities, our first obligation is not to the religious members of that organization. It's first to society. So the risk is that you might accidentally give more money than you had intended to a charitable organization that wasn't quite ready to pay back in the way that you thought that they were. And I would suggest that's a risk that Canadian society, by the way that we treat tax donations to registered charities, actually Canadian society expects foundations to do this. One might even say demands of foundations to do this. And as you know, Bruce, from some of our conversations, we were part of a group of organizations arguing that the new updated disbursement quota did actually have a requirement for impact investing of this kind. It hasn't happened yet. It exists very strongly in the United States. And we heard recently at the Sustainable Finance Forum from the MacArthur Foundation, who was careful to say, we're not lobbying for this. We're not here to lobby, but you have asked us, and the federal government asked MacArthur Foundation to share, say there is a tax treatment which supports impact investing by foundations. It's called program-related investments. And the idea is if a foundation invests in an investment which is related to its charitable programs, then it can take on a different type of risk, right? It's not a bad investor. If, let's say, it lends to an Indigenous charity or a Black-led charity, and they helped way more black-led organizations or indigenous purposes than they thought. And as a result of that, they weren't quite able to repay in the same way as they thought, but they've achieved even more impact. Well, the program related investments rubric in the United States would say you actually did the right thing as a charitable foundation. In Canada, it doesn't work quite the same way. I'll give a disclaimer to say I'm not a tax lawyer, I'm not any kind of lawyer, and so you'd have to check with a good lawyer on clarifying what I'm saying here. But in general, how do we understand risk depends on what kind of organization we are, and I think we need to learn how to do this stuff.
We're going to start to look with the last couple of questions ahead of the future. Now that the federal government has announced the creation of the long-awaited Social Innovation Advisory Council, how do you see this affecting the energy and commitment from the government to keep moving forward?
I saw the government's energy and commitment for moving this forward firsthand when we were in Ottawa. And when I saw a quorum of cabinet present in the events organized by Ryan Turnbull, I thought, this is really something. This is moving forward. And I have 2 degrees in politics. I don't mean to say I'm an expert on how to interpret things in Ottawa, but you don't see that every day. When I saw the recently released report on the Sustainable Finance Forum, it looked like a family photo album of Prime Minister Trudeau's cabinet. I mean, of our federal cabinet. Everybody was there. Everybody was signed up. So it's the kind of thing that if we were watching the federal government kind of shy away from this program, I don't think they'd be turning up for as many photo shoots here. I think they're there, and I think it's in their interest to be there in the long term. Here's why. I could give a long set of reasons why, but here are a couple of reasons. One is I think social finance is a far more effective delivery vehicle than government in general. And I think municipal, provincial, federal governments all realize delivering care and access to the most vulnerable people, it's not easily done by government. Actually, nonprofits are very good at delivering things. So it could be that it's a more effective, cost-effective way. It could be more efficient, more effective. The second is, I think that by funding grassroots organizations, ultimately social finance is about leaning in on the demand side for impact finance. So the nonprofit founder, leader, seeing all the vulnerable, like that's where this is supposed to be working, right? Where there's supposed to be this lightning bolt of social finance vision. If only I could make the case for here to create that social finance argument. We actually have reached a part of society that is often very hard for government to reach. So those are reasons why they should stay committed. But I also have seen it, and I guess I'm a person of faith, Bruce. I choose to believe, and even if the federal government gets it a little bit wrong in part of this, I've been studying what's happening around the world, and I think this program is really leading the way around the world. And I think I want to come into this really positive, really excited to see where this can go.
So, Graham, as we wind up this episode, I'd really like you to think to the future. As we continue to navigate economic ripple effects from the COVID pandemic, weather a prolonged period of inflation, and see geopolitical events such as the war in Ukraine affect the worldwide economy, what do you think these turbulent times mean for emerging approaches such as social finance?
So I hope that our listeners will forgive me for being a little bit technical in this conversation. But my answer to your question on this, Bruce, is I think we have incorrectly costed negative social externalities that we now know are important. What do I mean by that? When we can't go and visit our neighbor and have a cup of coffee with them because of COVID, we come to value what it means to be free to move around and see who we want. When we look at many of our large buildings, metro stations, etc., and we see men and women, human beings, who have no home to live in, and we realize this isn't just 1 or 2 homeless guys on the corner. This is a major challenge with access to homes. We need to figure that out. And they realize I don't feel comfortable going outside. I don't want to go to the metro anymore because the metro has, 30 people sleeping in it. And you realize, actually, I'm not going to get to my office because homelessness hasn't been dealt with. And you think whether it's because I don't feel good or I can't do my job, there's a cost to these things now. When it comes to the environment and we see the cost of global warming, climate change, and we realize somebody has to make sure this is costed correctly. I believe social finance is an opportunity for us to correctly cost those problems. And as soon as we correctly cost them, we have the possibility of financing the solutions for them. Homelessness is an issue which should not exist in Canada. In a country as wealthy as we are, we should have a roof over the head of every human being who sets foot and exists within our borders, however they got here. That's my view. We can solve that problem. We can't solve poverty. We can't solve mental illness. We can't solve every possible social justice issue. But if we understood the cost of that, we could solve it. And I believe that here we are with Imagine Canada as the champions of the social sector. I really believe the social sector has the keys to doing this. So to me, the future is we cost the problem, we finance it differently, and we have the delivery actually done by the social sector. And we're in an incredible win-win situation.
That's a wonderful way to wind up our episode. Graham, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much, Bruce.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsors, Carter's Professional Corporation and Sage Canada, for supporting our podcast.